Hey everyone, I wanted to go over the new and exciting news we got for Monster Hunter Stories 2 on the Nintendo Switch and on PC. And just about in the last month, the developers for Monster Hunter Stories 2 have been very active giving interviews to several Japanese outlets, detailing a little bit more about the game as to what players should be able to expect. Today we're going to go over an interview specifically with 4Gamer. This is a Japanese outlet that's very similar to like Famitsu or KoroKoro, that's rather well respected, and the developers for Monster Hunter Stories 2 did this interview with them, providing us with details for the game. It's a rather long and extensive interview in Japanese that thankfully NintendoEnthusiast.com translated a little bit of, specifically when it comes to the combat details, giving us a little bit of more insight as to what the developers are expecting to do with the combat encounters in this game, and specifically they focus on why the game is still turn-based combat as opposed to action more oriented combat like the traditional Monster Hunter series. So I wanted to go ahead and actually cover this because I found this little bit of couple details extremely interesting to go over. And obviously I will be putting the questions up on screen so you guys can follow along as well. 4Gamer asked the very first question: Monster Hunter Stories 2, like its predecessors, featured a turn-based combat battle system. Was this decided from the beginning of its development, and can you tell us why it hasn't changed? The development team answered, Stories is a non-action Monster Hunter series that we'd like to raise as a new pillar. We made it for people who aren't good at action games or just plain like RPGs. A lot of people who enjoy the first game voiced that this was a well-done Monster Hunter RPG, so we don't feel like changing it necessarily. And this basically proves that they are sticking to their guns. A lot of people did make criticisms when it came to reviews as to why it was a turn-based combat system, and it didn't necessarily feel like it evolved anything or added anything to the genre, as opposed to Monster Hunter's traditional series, where, you know, that's way more action oriented, whether it was the slower paced versions of the PSP and even back in the 3DS, which has been sped up significantly in World and now in Rise. But turn-based combat is completely different in that regard, and there were a lot of criticisms when it came to reviews, specifically when it came to that. For Gamer's second question is, tell us about some of the changes in the battle from the previous game and any of the implemented systems. The development team actually responded with, continuing from our previous response, we don't think that it would be okay to leave it just the same just because. Strengthening the random elements for what helps to win the rock paper scissors situations is a big part of the improvements in the battle system. For the previous game, we thought of a battle system with the aim of reading monster habits to gain the advantage in battle, but we felt that being able to get a full read made it boring, so we decided to shake things up a bit. However, that shaking up and resulted in a luck-based set of elements that we regretted because it felt like it didn't matter much whether you won or lost. For Monster Hunter Stories 2, we decided to do away with the previous policy and improve on the battle system. Our initial concern was whether it would be fun to actually win a rock paper scissors for certainty, but it ended up being a groundless apprehension, and we felt that we've improved the battle system into something completely fun. Advanced players of the action-based Monster Hunter games basically read monsters and run around as if it's forever their turn, and we think that we were able to reproduce that feeling in the battles of Monster Hunter Stories 2. You can easily get a feel for it even if you're not confident in your action gaming skills. It's also an RPG, so anyone who can win just by leveling up enough. We especially want people who aren't good at action games to play this game and get a taste for what makes Monster Hunter fun. There are two big takeaways from this specific quote here. The first one is the fact that they're acknowledging that they basically added luck incentives in the very first game, and the combat system, it was a little bit random altogether because of it. It didn't necessarily matter whether you won or lost because a lot of the elements came just of like traits and stuff that your monster had. So it was a little bit broken in that regard. I do think that the most interesting part of this quote is stating that advanced players for the action-based Monster Hunter games basically read monsters and run around as if this forever their turn. That is such an interesting perspective to have when it comes to Monster Hunter specifically, and it's so true that I'm actually surprised that I never even considered it, because you're always focusing on whatever it is combination of attacks that you're doing, whether it is you're trying to break apart, whether it is you're trying to cut a tail, whether it is you're trying to chip away at a specific area, but you're not ever concerned about what the monster is doing unless it's actually directly targeting you, or if you're playing in the single player aspect. you're always focusing on them doing big AoE attacks or maybe getting out of the area if you want to prevent some of the damage or evade it. Well, you're not necessarily too concerned whether it is they just finished doing an attack and whether they're going to do a follow-up, unless you know that monster can automatically KO you. So taking that simple idea of it's forever your turn and adding that into a turn-based RPG element is definitely an interesting perspective to have, and it reminds me of games like Final Fantasy VII Remake and even Atelier Ryza, the very first one, where they shook up combat significantly, where in previous games they weren't necessarily like that. I did a review for Atelier Ryza on the Nintendo Switch, and it's one of those games that traditionally has always been turn-based combat and stuff like that, but they added so much incentives to you actually continuing your attack as the enemies are ready to attack. So typically you would have, you attack and then they attack, and it's basically that waiting game of constantly just waiting to see whose turn it is. Whereas in Ryza, it was more like you're constantly attacking, building up gauge whenever your attack partners can actually follow up their attacks, and then the enemy gets to attack in between all of that chaos. And it feels like very much controlled chaos. That's something that Final Fantasy VII Remake did extremely well, where you're constantly attacking, you're constantly building up AP, you're constantly building up meter, and the enemies are still attacking. You can block their attacks, you can avoid them or whatever, heal through them, but it's constantly just keeping that meter going, and you're constantly just keeping things building up, as opposed to just waiting for one big thing to happen and then the other big thing happens. It's a little bit more slow. If they could take that approach for this game, and I actually haven't necessarily seen whether it actually does take that big approach, it would be such a big change for this franchise, and I think it would bring a lot more eyes into the series in general if they could add some of those mechanics going forward. The last question that 4Gamer asks is, now we have 4 weapons, the Great Sword, Sword and Shield, Hammer, and Hunting Horn, and the addition of the newly announced gun lance. Can you tell us about how was that decided? The development team's answer was, that part about how to make an RPG different is important. For example, the action game Monster Hunter games have various elements that differentiate with each weapon, from a sense of touch to usability. For Monster Hunter Stories, we must think about differentiating the turn-based battles. While we understand that the appearances, abilities, and popularity matter, this is a result of focusing on how to make a difference and how to play. Again, Monster Hunter Stories isn't about having fun hunting as a hunter, but enjoying racing monsters as a rider. So instead of adding more weapon variety, we focus on adding more monsters. And that is also another big clear tell when it comes to this specific interview, when they're basically telling you that they're trading weapon variety for monster totals, like basically providing players with a whole heck of a lot of things to be able to hunt and raise and basically customize as basically your pet monsters, if you will, or as you become a rider, instead of just giving you way more weapons than the traditional Monster Hunter experience. We do know, like I've talked about several times before, because we have just about all the details when it comes to this game, we do have a full monster list of this, basically the total of monsters available in this game, and there is definitely over 100 monsters. So the fact that there's only 5 playable weapons being offset with monster variety and monster totals, basically the amount of total that you can actually hunt, it's a pretty clear tell of that statement, that they're basically just following the idea of they're trying to give you variety when it comes to hunting, not necessarily of the way that you're actually supposed to be playing. Because monsters do play such a big role in assisting you throughout combat, and not necessarily your weapon being the main attraction as to how you play your game. But yeah, that's going to be it for this video. There's certainly a couple of more quotes in that specific 4Gamer interview that I do want to go over whenever due time. I also do want to, the whole DNA mechanic that they introduced in the last trailer, I thought that was extremely interesting and something that I feel like is going to be a big game changer when it comes to this game. And how you go about experiencing your playthrough in general, because they are providing you with the way to customize a monster however you want, instead of necessarily focusing on your weapon being the main added incentive as to being the most powerful thing that you can actually abuse. And I am going to see if I can put together, hopefully before E3 does happen, that big video that I've been trying to compile together with just about all of the details that we know about the game so far and the stuff that Capcom hasn't necessarily made public. There is a whole heck of a lot of information that's out there already. I've talked about that several times. So hopefully before E3 does air, which is I believe the week of the 12th, and Jeff Keighley's having their own thing or whatever a couple of days prior, I will try to compile all that information together and have a video up at the very least at the beginning of June. So hopefully within the next couple of weeks I should be able to have that out. There's going to be a rather meaty one where we basically go over everything we know about Monster Hunter Stories 2 going forward. So that's going to be it for this video. If you're brand new to my channel, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Do hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up. And as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya!